Okay, our portion this morning is Mark 12, verses 18 to 27. And that's it's on page 718 in your brown pew Bibles, if you want to turn there. Mark 12, 18 to 27. Why don't we stand to read it? I like it when we do that. I always forget. Let's stand up and read this together. Then the Sadducees, who say there is no resurrection, came to him with a question. That's Jesus. "Teacher," they said, "Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, the man must marry the widow and have children for his brother. Now, there were 7 brothers. The first one married and died without leaving any children. The second one married the widow, but he also died, leaving no child. It was the same with the third. In fact, none of the 7 left any children. Last of all, the woman died too. At the resurrection, whose wife will she be, since the 7 were married to her?" Jesus replied, "Are you not in error because you do not know the scriptures or the power of God? When the dead rise, they will neither marry nor be given in marriage. They will be like the angels in heaven. Now, about the dead rising, have you not read in the book of Moses, in the account of the bush, how God said to him, 'I am the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob. He is not the God of the dead, but of the living. You are badly mistaken.'" This is the word of the Lord. All right. So if you could ask Jesus one question, just any question at all, what would it be? Do you ever think about that? We're continuing our series on questioning Jesus, and we're looking at 8 or 9 questions that Jesus was asked during his ministry. We were careful not to call it a series about questions that Jesus answered, because he didn't always exactly answer them. But we're looking at questions that Jesus was asked. And we had Kyle kick us off 2 weeks ago, asking the question, who is my neighbor? That was a good question. Wes last week did, don't you care if we drown? That's a deep one, literally. So we've had 2 great questions so far, really good questions. This morning, we have a terrible question. This is an awful question. It's just a boring question. Like, what a question to ask God incarnate in human form. You have this one chance to ask him something really good, and you ask him this. They ask him this question about some trivial matter about how the law of Moses is going to be applied in the resurrection in some detailed way. Boring question, boring people. I'm going to preach a really boring sermon just so you really get the idea. So Jesus' inquirers here are Sadducees. And not to be confused with Pharisees, Sadducees are sad, you see. My mother would explain it to me like that. And the reason that they're sad is because they don't believe in the resurrection. They don't think there's going to be an afterlife, that the dead will rise. None of that. That's what it says in verse 18 of our portion there this morning. They were boring people. They asked Jesus a boring question. And Jesus, in his response, I think, opens up what is a breathtaking reality. He exposed the Sadducees, their minuscule view of human beings, this minuscule view of the grand narrative of Scripture, and this minuscule view, ultimately, of the power of God. So the Sadducees ask their question, and they're trying to skewer Jesus. They're trying to show him how he's wrong, there's no resurrection. And in verse 24, Jesus begins his answer. "Are you not in error?" I don't know, are we? I don't know, are you? Let's have a look. They start in verse 19, and they're quoting this Mosaic law. "Teacher," they said, "Moses wrote for us that if a man's brother dies and leaves a wife but no children, the man must marry the widow and raise up offspring for his brother." Are they correct? Yeah, they are. That's true. That's in there. No error there. Verses 20 to 22 is their hypothetical scenario. It can't be wrong in a hypothetical scenario. No error there. And then verse 23 is their question. I mean, can a question be wrong? Jesus says they're in error. They're in error not because of what they said per se, but because of what their question assumes. They don't believe in a resurrection. That's their problem. That's their error. They say they know God, they say they know the scriptures, and yet they think that this life is God's great purpose for his glory. This is as profound as it gets, that the grand narrative of Scripture is all leading up to this, what we have here. That it's just a series of dead heroes. That God be praised. He's the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob, but they're all dead. All these dead people. Good for them. I hope they enjoyed their lives. Their lot is up. What a boring view of God and a boring view of his purpose. And the Sadducees seems to have this idea that the world as it is today is the world as it pretty much should be. They were wrong. This is nothing. This world is a grave. So we're going to unpack this morning why that was the case, why they were wrong ultimately about the power of God in the resurrection. So the first thing we're going to look at is the power of God in making a world better than this one. The second thing we're going to look at is the power of God in making something better than us, the dead people. And then thirdly, we're going to look at the power of God in being the God of a people better than the people that we are. Okay, let's get cooking. So this world we live in, let's talk about that for a bit. It's a pretty broken world. I want to look at this morning, particularly as we're looking at the way that the Sadducees framed their question around marriage in the resurrection. What is the best, maybe I'll phrase it like this, what is the most intense pleasure that we can have as human beings on this earth? Outside of God, what is it? Call it out. Who said it? Sex, that's it. He's nailed it in one. He's been attending our marriage and parenting classes, I see. Yeah, that's what it is, right? That's the most intense thing as humans in terms of pleasure outside of God that we experience. There it is. You heard me say it. What's probably the deepest human experience then? Maybe romance? Is that fair to say? I think so. That romantic intimacy. Yet simultaneously, these areas provide, don't they? Maybe the greatest amount of pain on that kind of human level for us in our lives. It's always the pursuit of these things rather than the reality of them that is actually the strongest. You never really feel like you've arrived there. It's always if only. And sex is something so fervently pursued by us as humans. People throw away their marriages, their careers, their clean criminal records. They just do some really stupid things in pursuit of sexual pleasure. Islamic theology, actually, if I may go here, is basically like suffer holiness in this life to get the reward of eternal paradise. And their paradise is pretty explicit. I've been reading up all about this at the risk of making any Muslim converts this morning. Not all Muslims believe in 72 virgins. The more conservative scholars do believe in them, but it's pretty much a kind of cattle market for casual sex in Muslim paradise. That is their view of the ultimate. How can we persuade people to be Muslims and do the things they do, particularly in extremism? That's some of what you get. And there's this idea on earth that this inner deep desire that we have for pleasure is met with sex. It isn't. There's something much greater than that coming. Romantic love, very, very similar. All of our art, or not all of it, but a great proportion of it is focused on this, particularly our music, our songs, our novels, our films. All these things, they often find that the deepest thing that they can sing about and talk about is human romantic intimacy. And it is a deep thing in this earth. And so we pursue this deeply, badly. And even in the best marriages without God, the reality is that neither sex nor romance gives us what we're really craving for. The fervor of our pursuit of them isn't matched by the reality. It doesn't quite scratch the itch. So according to Jesus in this text, our eternity, it doesn't even contain marriage. There's no sex in heaven. There's no romance in heaven, not as we know it today. These things are present on this earth to give us a sense of something cosmic. But our desire to be deeply and unconditionally loved and accepted and cherished are never, again, even in the very best of marriages, they're never met by a spouse. And our desire to find true pleasure is never ultimately met by sex. And so what this means is that if you have experienced great pain in your life because of the absence of sex or of romance, that is very understandable, that you feel that pain. It doesn't mean that you're shallow. The Bible affirms that these things are painful because we were made to take pleasure. We were created to experience deep and intense pleasure. And sex is a taste of that, but it's not the real thing. And people get in trouble with sex when they try and make it bear a load that it was never intended to bear. God in his mercy has given us, all kinds of pleasures in this life for a time to sustain us until we experience the pleasure that we were really made for, which is an eternity with him. Knowing him, experiencing him. That is the pleasure that we are crying out for when we seek things that are less than him. Likewise, if you've experienced great pain in your life because of the absence of sex and romance, actually it's a very understandable thing that you feel that pain. It doesn't mean that you're shallow. It's exactly the same as romance is sex. And I'm talking, by the way, to the married as well as the unmarried. That for many people, maybe for singles more than you would think, a lot of people find that their marriages are void of romance. And guys, it's on us to make that happen, make it full of romance. But it makes sense that we experience a great amount of pain if there is not that deep human intimacy in our lives. Of course it's painful to be alone. But this is the crucial thing. You're not missing the thing itself. You're just missing the appetizer. Earthly marriage and romance is a taste of it. It's a taste, actually, of how you'll relate to all human beings in the resurrection, including your current spouse, if you have one. But it's not the thing itself. It points to how we are supposed to find fulfillment in God. So Jesus was known, actually, often for being pretty sharp in the way that he responded to some ill-intentioned questions. But he really lets them have it with this one. He was uncharacteristically scathing, I think. You are badly mistaken, he says in the last verse of our text. Badly mistaken. The pursuits of this world are not the end of all things. You don't know the scriptures. You definitely do not know the power of God. He has put eternity into the heart of mankind. He has put a craving for the divine within our fiber. And the fact that these insatiable desires exist says something to us about our eternity. To paraphrase C.S. Lewis, did it ever occur to you that if you find that the most intense desires within yourself cannot be satisfied by anything in this world, even the very best of things, that maybe, just maybe, you were made for another world? Because I do find that my deepest longings within my heart are left ultimately wholly unsatisfied by what can be, at times, a very painful world. And that if this is the only world that we live in, if this really is it, and if there is no resurrection, as the Sadducees say, then I think we live in a very boring and shallow existence. I think we live in a universe without anything interesting to it. It's a trivial and meaningless, purposeless universe. It's boring, but it's not the universe that we are in. Okay, that's the first bit about the world we live in, and the desires that we have, they will be met. There must be something more than this. Let's talk about the power of God in making something better than us. So humans, of course, are God's great creation. We are the crowning glory, are we not? But if we're honest, we're not all that great. And I consider myself a pretty average person, just, generally speaking. But actually, when statistics talk about the average person, you often think of yourself. I do anyway. But actually, the average person is, in actual fact, dead. The average person is dead as a doornail. That is a truism. There was a factoid that circulated a few years ago that because of the population spike, that there's more people living today than have died. That's nonsense. That was shown to be nonsense. The dead far outnumber the living, or I suppose I should say dying. And even if you assume that people have only been around for 6,000 years, if you're a classical creationist, a conservative estimate of the number of dead people is about actually 65 billion. It's something in that ballpark. It's hard to know. That's 65 billion people that are dead to our 7 billion living. And to put that into perspective, if you can imagine them sort of laid out about the same square width as the Empire State Building, they would stack 2,000 kilometers high. That's like the width of BC and Alberta. They were just huge, big stack of them. Another way of imagining that, if these bodies, they weren't being cremated or rotting or being buried or anything, if you took all these bodies and laid them out into where humans actually live, they're sort of built on bits of the earth, which is about 3% of the land of planet Earth, which is typically where humans live and where they also usually die. They would be stacked 14 bodies high in all of our cities and towns and kind of populated areas. You would have 14 bodies high if people just sort of died where they died and they stayed there, the body stayed there. Can you imagine that, walking around Vancouver and you're just walking on this bed of bodies? It would be disgusting. And I actually sense that it's unfortunate for the spreading of the gospel that this is not the case. I think that we would have an easier time convincing people that there was something badly wrong with our world if there were 14 bodies high everywhere you went. The YOLO theme of our city would take on a rather more somber tone, I think. Another point we could make is that as we feed off of meat, we're feeding off the corpses of dead animals. It's not a case for vegetarianism here, it's just a case for some thoughtful, being a thoughtful carnivore. It is possible, obviously, to live as a vegetarian. We have knowledge of nutrients and how to get them and that. But if you were lost out in the wild, you wouldn't be able to eat leaves for very long. You would need to kill something and eat it. So those nutrients become you. You're literally made of death. We're feeding off of death. So that's my point in this point. Humanity is mainly dead. We're a dead people. If you look at the legacy of Adam's race, we're mainly just a huge pile of corpses. That's pretty much what we are. Mostly dead people. Few people, 7 billion of us, that's some number, who have death coming to them pretty quickly. The dead and the dying, that's who we are. And this is a point that must be stressed regularly from the pulpit, I really do believe, that we are dying. We are not living forever in this state. Just like the remainder of Adam's life after the fall was a death, it was a dying, it was a waiting to die, it was a rotting, it was an aging, as we like to call it. And as a society, we just gloss over the awfulness of death so much. Like we like to get rid of bodies, and even the way that a lot of funeral services talk about death, it's always dignity in dying. Like, dignity in dying. Are you high? Like, you're talking about a process where someone goes from having a pretty purposeful, like a will, they're acting on decisions. There's a real dignity about living. They're going from that to, like, you're dead. You're a rotting piece of meat. Like, that's not dignified. And yeah, we talk about, like, aging, I'm aging. Like it sounds so distinguished. Like, you're not a piece of cheddar or a scotch. Like, you look at all those wrinkles and gray hairs and even bald patches as I'm suffering here. Like, you're not aging, you're dying. Like, that's what's happening to us. Like, that's the reality of it. Right? We'll get to how there's a better reality waiting for us, but that's the reality that we're experiencing. The dead and the dying. That is humanity. Another point I want to make about this is that the only reason that we've actually been able to maintain ourselves as a living people is obviously because we're reproducing. Do you ever think that if we stop having babies in like 100 years or so, we're done? Like, that's not that's a tiny fraction of the world as we've lived it so far, of the history of humanity. But if we stop reproducing, we will be dead. That's the only reason that we're continuing. And there's actually a lot in our passage about this idea. It's kind of hidden. But Jesus says in verse 25 that we will be like the angels in heaven. Now, what's he saying here? That we will not have sexual desires in heaven? That's often been the meaning that we've taken out of it, that we won't have a sexuality. I don't think that's what he's saying. And I think actually the clue, sort of cheating here a little bit, is in the Luke account of this. That's in chapter 20, if you do want to look it up. In verse 35, it says, "But those who are considered worthy of taking part in the age to come and in the resurrection from the dead will neither marry nor be given in marriage, and they can no longer die, for they are like the angels." They can no longer die, for they are like the angels. So what has marriage to do with my death? Why, as a result of not dying, would I need to be married? You see the logical point he's making. You don't need to get married because you're not going to die. Implies you do need to get married here on earth because you are going to die. Not everyone needs to, but some people need to reproduce. That's it. It's because they won't have to reproduce. You're like the angels in not dying. Therefore, you don't need to get married to propagate the planet. So just to be utterly clear, when we're talking about being like the angels in heaven, we're talking about this, worshiping God for all eternity in heaven. We're not talking about this. Not what we're talking about. Okay, get rid of that. Like all of you is resurrected. Like your whole body, you're resurrected. But actually, as an aside, you may be wondering, my position on this is, I don't think we have like a kind of neutralizing of our sexual desires in heaven. I just think that they are completely outshined and just captivated by the glory of God and the presence of God. That it's just a step up. I think we talked about that in part 1. So humanity is dead. On top of all that, ultimately, of course, we're sinners. We're nasty to one another. God is mighty to make a people better than the people that we are. Hence, the resurrection into sinless, deathless life. The final and ultimate reason why I believe that there is a resurrection and what I see in our passage here is that Sadducees failing to see the power of God in being the God of a people better than the people that we are. Now, if you take the Sadducees literally, this is what they're imagining in this awesome encounter that God had with Moses. So this is just absolutely phenomenally historical in the history of redemption. God's encounter with God when there's the burning bush, and he introduces himself. Do you know who I am? Like what is my name? I am the God of, and then what does he say? This is what the Sadducees are imagining. They're still imagining their pile of bodies stacked 14 high. It's huge, it's just trampling on all these bodies everywhere. I am God. I am the God of, dang it, now where did he go? So here he is. He's under this body. Here, just pull this one off. Abraham. I am the God of Abraham. It's my man right here. It's Abraham. I am the God of Abraham. And Abraham, dead body of Abraham. Look at it. What a legend. Father of a multitude, they call him. All people, just get rid of him. Now, I'm the God of Isaac. What a legend. I'm the God of Isaac. Get rid of his dead body again. Throw him down. And this is the real hero. Let me get this guy out. Here he comes. This is Jacob. Oh, his head's stuck in the... Oh, it's pulled right off there. This is Jacob, though, Moses. I can assure you. Here's a hit where I busted him up earlier. I am the God. All these, far as the eye can see, all of these corpses. This is the God that I am, Moses. I am faithful to these people. I gave them my covenant, and I was faithful to it, and I stood by them, just as I will be with you. Now, Moses, come. Join me. Be faithful to me. You will end up like these people. What a psychopath. Who would want to follow that God? Whoa. It would be like marrying the woman in the Sadducees example whose 6 previous husbands has somehow died of apparently natural causes. You wouldn't want to do it. Who's the God that I can follow that doesn't end up with me being another body in the pile? What's the point in all that stuff he promised, all that he led them through, if it just ends in death? It's stupid. God is almighty. He's the most high God of the universe. Do you really think that this world, this people, this story is his legacy? I don't think so. What a dull view of God. What a boring question to ask. and to assume that about the nature of things. And this is what Jesus is trying to communicate to the Sadducee that asked him this stupid question. He's not the God of the dead, you plum. He's the God of the living. And the fact that he is a God of a people who live forevermore says something about the God that we worship. It speaks loudly about who he is. He is mighty in salvation. He is powerful in resurrection. The Sadducees were in error because they had no idea about the power of God and who he was. You do not know the power of God. He is not the God of the corpses. He's not the king of the hill, where the hill is this big burial mound, and the grand narrative of Scripture is all leading up to him being the God of a bigger and bigger and bigger pile of corpses who are slightly better and better and more holy in their life, which is now gone, but that's the end of it. God is a God worthy of a greater people than we are. That's the reality. He deserves to be the God of a living people. Exodus 32:12. This is what happens when they're set free. Why should the Egyptians say it was with evil intent that he brought them out, to kill them in the mountains and to wipe them off the face of the earth? Turn from your fierce anger, relent, and do not bring disaster on your people. This is what's being cried out to God. Like, don't kill us in the wilderness after you've just saved us. Why? Because the Egyptians are going to say something about God. They're going to say, well, he's evil intent. Look at what he's done. He's the plum now. He's set free all these people in the desert, and now they're all dead. Right? If God is the God of dead, it's not God of the dead. It's not ultimately us that looks stupid. Really, it's him. And that's kind of a humbling thought, isn't it? Jesus did not effect salvation for God's people mainly because of the people. It was mainly because of the God. God is a God worthy of a greater people than us. Jesus went to the cross because God is a living God, and he will have a people who live. And the very firstborn of this new humanity of living people is Jesus. He is bringing about a humanity that is not a big pile of corpses stacked 14 high in every inhabited space on earth. He is ushering in a humanity that lives. And that is something. When people ask me which God I follow, in fact, nobody's ever actually asked me that, but hypothetically, if they did, I wouldn't tell them that I'm the God of Abraham or the God of Isaac or the God of Jacob. What would we say? We would say that I worship the God of Jesus Christ. Why? Because of all the 65 billion corpses and the 7 billion soon-to-be corpses, he is the only one that is living. He is neither dead nor dying. He is the resurrection and the life. He arose from the dead to be the king of all who awake from the dead into an eternal life with him. Again, in the Luke account, Jesus adds, they are God's children, since they are children of the resurrection. Right now, we're part of a crappy, dead humanity. One day, we will arise to be a part of a living humanity. And that is an awesome idea. The Sadducees picked the wrong guy to try and skewer with this question about the resurrection from the dead. They picked the resurrection himself. So as we conclude, you see here the power of God in the resurrection. Right now, we pursue pleasures on earth that are wholly unfulfilled, and they point to a reality much better than this. These unfulfilled desires show that we are a dead people. Like there's something wrong with this world. This world itself is dead. Not just the world, but the people who are in it. This is not what humanity is supposed to be. Death is not who we are. And the God we worship is not the God of the dead. He is the God of the living. And that is that. The end.